Hello again. This is Professor Holbrook of American history, modern American history from 1877 through the early 2000s. This is the summer of 2024. I'm in Maryland, Columbia, Maryland, and recording my lectures for my online course in American history. So today we're going to talk about the 1990s in America. So this was an interesting time, and I remember most of it quite well. It was a time of evolutionary technological change. I still remember in the early 1990s having to connect my laptop or computer to a telephone line and taking an hour to upload one email. That was the early 1990s. Things have changed. So there's been unprecedented global flow of goods and people with globalization, capital, labor. There's been a kind of an ambiguous and amorphous war on terror going on for the last 24 years. We'll talk about that next time. There's been accelerating inequality between the haves and the haves not, between those at the top of our economic pyramid and those at the bottom. Growing diversity and culture, a changing climate, and a political stalemate with a lot of partisan division. William Faulkner said the past is never really dead. It's not even past, which basically he's referring to the fact that the past continues to have a strong influence on the present and future. So the last decades of American history have culminated in an unprecedented era of advancement and progress, but also partisan division, racial tension, gender divides, sluggish economic growth, widening inequalities, resentment against elites of all kinds, military intervention, so what some people call the endless war, and anxiety about the future of the United States. All of these are part of all of these are part of our current malaise or angst in American culture. And I'm multitasking here. Sorry about that. So, at the end of the 1880s, the vice president of the United States under Ronald Reagan was George H.W. Bush, a World War II veteran, former chairman of the former director of the CIA. He was the president of a successful oil company in Texas, chair of the Republican National Committee, and a member of the House of Representatives from Texas. He ran against Reagan in 1980 and became unsuccessfully became the vice presidential candidate with Reagan. In 1984, 1988, Michael Dukakis, a proud liberal from Massachusetts, challenged the senior Bush for the White House, and George H.W. Bush won that presidential election. And having a little problem here with sorry, give me a second to work on this. There we go. So, Dukakis ran a weak campaign, but Bush was a Connecticut aristocrat who had never fully been embraced by the rise of the religious right or the new conservatism. He was always suspected as a moderate. Nevertheless, Bush's campaign hammered Dukakis with moral and cultural issues successfully. Some people point to that as the beginning of dirty tricks in campaigning. However, you have to go back even further to Nixon and beyond, and you can probably find it pretty much throughout American history. But it took negative advertisement took on a new significance during that campaign. Also, Bush got lucky in the foreign diplomatic area. Several things fell his way, namely the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapsed during Bush's tenure in 1989, shortly after he was elected. The Soviet Union collapsed mainly from economic issues, with a stagnant economy unable to keep up with the Reagan military buildup, and finally just had to throw in the towel. The leader of the Soviet Union at that time was Mikhail Gorbachev. He loosened the Soviet Union's tight personal restraints and censorship. This was called glasnost, and he liberalized the Soviet political machinery, which was called in Russian perestroika. And in 1991, he resigned from office, declaring that the Soviet Union no longer existed. He's probably not very loved in current Russia for those who long for the Soviet Empire. The Gulf War began early in Bush Sr.'s tenure. It was in Iraq, but it's called the Gulf War. Iraq invaded Kuwait, and H.W. Bush organized a coalition of under the United Nations banner to push Iraq back into its own territory and to guarantee Kuwait's sovereignty and integrity as a country. So Congress granted President Bush the approval to intervene, something that has been a spotty issue in recent years, whether presidents even bother to ask Congress for permission for wars. The United States laid the groundwork for the intervention in August, Operation Desert Shield, and commenced combat operations January 1991. The Gulf War was a swift victory for the United States. I think I have a picture here if I can successfully get it up. Okay, come on. I have a problem trying to do two things at once. There we go. So there's a picture of the Gulf War. The Iraqi military set fire to Kuwait's oil fields, many of which burned for months. This is 1991, as the Iraqis were retreating before the coalition's forces. So this brings us to the next election in 1992. Bush's popularity seemed to suggest an easy re-election in 1992, but he had not won over the new right, also known as the religious right in some circles. The aggressively conservative wing of the Republican Party was called the New Right, and they were in ascendance. Despite his attacks on Dukakis, his embrace of the flag, and his pledge and promise, read my lips, no new taxes, which was probably a big mistake because he ended up raising taxes anyway. He faced a primary challenge from a political commentator, Patrick Buchanan, who had been a White House advisor. I think he might have been press secretary or one of the speechwriters for Nixon. He cast Bush as a moderate who was unwilling to fight for conservative American values in the nation's ongoing culture war. Patrick Buchanan was like an early proto-MAGA. Some people might disagree with me on this, but he was very concerned about shutting down immigration across the southern border, about making America great again, about conservative cultural values, and so in some ways you can see him as a forerunner of our current MAGA movement. So Buchanan ran against Bush. Bush won the nomination, but some political analysts believe that Bush was weakened politically by Buchanan's primary challenge. Most other Democrats thought that Bush would be unbeatable in 1992 because of the successful Gulf War, because of his personal popularity. The economy seemed to be doing well up to that point. And so most of the strongest Democratic candidates decided not to run, but a political maverick and a relatively unknown Arkansas governor named Bill Clinton did run. Bill Clinton had some significant negatives. He was charged by charges of marital infidelity, and he was accused of being a draft dodger during the Vietnam War. But he was a good politician, good political instincts with enormous charisma and a skilled professional political team. So Bill Clinton ran in I believe it was 92, wasn't it? Yes, 92. But then something interesting happened. There was a downturn in the economy, and there was also the rise, kind of a newly ascendant rise of globalization, which we'll probably talk more about. Specifically, the NAFTA treaty. The NAFTA treaty was between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. It was called the NAFTA, short for the North American Free Trade Agreement, which seems like a great idea to unify Canada, Mexico, and the United States in one trading bloc or one financial bloc without any tariffs, so that Mexican products can compete freely with American products or Canadian products. Sounds like a great idea on paper. And it was highly supported by Bush. And then after his election, Bill Clinton also supported it and eventually signed it. It was not supported by H. Ross Perot, a Texas oil billionaire who was opposed to the globalization, the offshoring of American businesses and manufacturing, and the NAFTA agreement. And so he decided to run as an independent against both the Republicans with George H.W. Bush and the Democrats with Bill Clinton. H. Ross Perot formed his own independent political party and ran against the two parties. He opposed NAFTA and the offshoring of American manufacturing. If you get a chance, go on YouTube and look up H. Ross Perot, that giant sucking sound. And you'll hear him talking about, he was predicting actually that when NAFTA was signed, there would be a giant sucking sound of American manufacturing jobs leaving the United States and going to Mexico. Actually also China and other parts of the globe where labor was much cheaper. And he was probably right in many ways. So that was a lot of his appeal to people who were oriented, moderates who were oriented to be independents rather than partisans of one political party or another. Surprisingly, Perot earned almost 19% of the vote, the popular vote. He did not, however, win any electoral votes. Nevertheless, he took more votes away from Bush and allowed Clinton to win with only 43% of the popular vote. Let me see if I can show you a couple pictures here for your edification. So there's Clinton. There we go. So here's a picture of the three candidates that were running in 1992. Bill Clinton received 44, almost 45 million votes. H.W. Bush, George H.W. Bush received almost 40 million votes, and H. Ross Perot received nearly 20 million. So 45, 40, and 20. It's the best that any independent candidate has ever done in an American election in terms of percentages. In terms of electoral votes, however, the imbalance is even greater. Bill Clinton won 370 of the electoral votes. 270 are needed. George H.W. Bush missed that and won only 168. H. Ross Perot didn't win any. So there you have it. That was the race of 1992, and was just enough to get Bill Clinton into the White House and to give Democrats another shot at governing after, 12 years of Reagan and Bush administration, since the 4 years of Carter, then 12 years of Reagan Bush, and now Bill Clinton is in office again. Let me go back here. So Bill Clinton led a faction within the Democratic Party that became nicknamed the New Democrats. because they were trying to distance themselves from the disastrous Democratic candidacies in, well, really beginning with Hubert Humphrey, I suppose, although he came very close to Nixon, and some of the others, Dukakis, for example, especially, and many of the, I forget the name of the one between Humphrey and Dukakis. I can see his face, but I can't remember his name, but he went down in flames. They were very liberal in the old school liberal sense, and they were not making their case effectively with the American public. The last successful liberal president before the election of Carter and Clinton was LBJ. Believe it or not, LBJ was quite liberal in terms of wanting to enlarge government and develop the war on poverty and his position on racial issues. But with Carter, you have with Jimmy Carter, you have a more moderate style Democratic administration. And then with Bill Clinton, he also styled himself as a conservative or at least a moderate Democrat. Some of my conservative friends will choke to hear that, but that's true. In terms of the overall scale of Democratic candidates in the end of the 20th century, Bill Clinton was relatively conservative, especially economically. Clinton won the election, but the Reagan Revolution was still going on, and conservative thought was still ascendant. Clinton and his running mate, Tennessee Senator Albert Gore Jr., both were moderate Southerners. They promised a path away from the old liberalism of the 1970s and 80s and the landslide electoral defeats of the 1980s. They were Democrats, but they were more conservative in relative terms compared to the liberal candidacies before them, so they were called New Democrats. And this brings us back to NAFTA. I already told you it's the North American Free Trade Agreement. Clinton reversed decades of Democratic opposition to the free trade agreement and opened the nation's northern and southern borders to the free flow of capital and goods. In other words, NAFTA had been more of a Republican idea. Democrats had opposed it because they were concerned about labor regulation. They were concerned about the labor conditions that Mexican laborers would work under compared to Detroit automakers, for example. They were also concerned about less environmental regulation, and rightly so, probably. But Clinton kind of saw the handwriting on the wall and took a more what we call neoliberal approach to economics and signed the NAFTA agreement into existence. Cities, particularly in the nation's Rust Belt, blasted the agreement for opening American workers to competition by low-paid foreign workers. So if in a Detroit Ford auto plant, if a auto worker in a manufacturing plant was making $30 an hour with a good pension and good health benefits across the border in the northern part of Mexico, Mexican workers might be earning $5 or $6 a day, doing the same work with very little in the way of pensions or health care. So it made sense to these multinational companies to relocate their manufacturing in Mexico, eventually in China and other parts of the world as well. This is the challenge of globalization that has brought about a pretty severe economic backlash. So let me pull up another picture here. We've seen this one. So, oops, I'm going the wrong way. That's the problem. Here we go. So here's a picture of on the left you see Rust Belt voters in the voting blue in 1992 when Clinton won the presidency. Look at the states around the Great Lakes, specifically Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. All but Indiana are solidly blue. Indiana was conservative and was red, very evangelical. Then if you look down to the right, you'll see the voting pattern in 2016. And all of those states with the exception of Illinois, had turned red. And that's 2016 is when Donald J. Trump was elected. Big shocker. Some of the Democratic strategists were taking Wisconsin, for example, or Michigan for granted as true blue states that would always vote Democrat. However, in this election, they were shocked to find that that was not the case. You can look at all kinds of possible explanations, including cultural explanations, but one simple explanation is simply the effects of globalization and offshoring of American businesses. So you have places in Pennsylvania and Ohio, Michigan that are desolate, that used to be very prosperous because the manufacturing base has moved away. So these folks became disillusioned with the Democratic Party and voted Republican primarily over economic issues, at least according to this analytical angle. Also, while Clinton was in office, he developed what's called the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Many of you are probably way too young to remember that. It was reversed by Barack Obama, or eliminated. But there was a time when you could not, when someone who had a same-sex attraction or same-sex lifestyle could not serve in the U.S. military. And Bill Clinton looked for a compromise solution. So he instituted the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which removed any questions about sexual orientation from the interview process and induction into the military. The military was not allowed to ask you what was your sexual orientation, and you were encouraged not to tell. If you did tell or were found out, they could possibly expel you, but it was don't ask, don't tell. That was a step towards a more inclusive approach to the military. And but it did require that military personnel keep their sexual orientation private. Also, during Clinton's administration, there was an attempt to institute national health care, something that's been kind of pending in the wings since FDR in the 1940s. There have been attempts to develop a national health care system. Clinton put forward universal health care as a major policy goal, and First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton spearheaded the effort to get it approved. But the push for the national health care law under Clinton in the 1990s collapsed. Conservatives revolted. The healthcare industry flooded the airways with attack ads. Of course, lobbyists invested a huge amount of dollars in persuading congressmen and women to not vote for it. Clinton struggled with congressional Democrats, and the voters bristled. So the effort was defeated, and as a consequence, there was no national health care until Barack Obama came along and made another attempt. So another issue that happened during this time was scandal in the White House. If you're taking this class, you're probably too young to remember Bill Clinton's administration or the scandal with Monica Lewinsky. She was a young intern, I think 19 or 20 years old, working in the White House, and she and President Clinton became sexually involved, and it somehow came out and became a public scandal, and the details of their affair became public and eventually led to an impeachment effort. There had always been rumors of sexual misconduct swirling around Bill Clinton before and after this time. But up to this point, nothing had stuck to him. And this one actually didn't stick to him, although it did give the new right a chance, an opening to try to impeach him. This is really the beginning of partisan impeachments. The impeachment of Nixon was not really partisan. The Republicans, it was bipartisan. Nixon was clearly wrong. Republicans basically eventually came around to agreeing with the impeachment because of his illegal conduct and misdeeds. But with Bill Clinton, now you have a partisan impeachment. where the other party is looking for any possible excuse to impeach the president of the opposing party. So, congressional investigators targeted the allegations, and Clinton denied having sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky before a grand jury, which, depending on your definition of sexual relations, could have been perjury. But I think he finessed his definition so that in his mind it was not perjury. In December 1998, the House of Representatives voted to impeach the president. Nevertheless, it was wildly unpopular with the majority of the American public. The economy was doing well. Clinton was probably one of the best presidents in terms of managing the economy. He finished his administration with a balanced budget, which is unheard of then and pretty much almost impossible to imagine now. And so American citizens tend to be very influenced by their pocketbook, and their pocketbooks were good in 1998. So the House of Republicans basically made a serious mistake of political judgment and impeached Clinton and sent it over to the Senate for a trial. 2/3 of the Americans disapproved, and a majority told Gallup pollsters that Republicans had abused their constitutional authority. Clinton's approval rating jumped up to 78% despite his scandal. And so that is a cautionary tale to partisans who try to carry out impeachments for political purposes rather than legal or moral purposes. And this brings us up to the 2000 election, which pitted the former Vice President Albert Gore Jr. of Tennessee against Texas George W. Bush, the son of H.W. Bush. George W. had been twice elected governor of Texas. He had good relations with the Mexican governor of Sonora, who was to become the Mexican president. He spoke a little bit of Spanish. Gore ran as a pragmatic, moderate liberal. Bush ran also as a moderate, claiming to represent compassionate conservatism, and gave a new emphasis on faith-based NGOs, faith-based politics. He was an outspoken evangelical, and he had a little more charisma than Gore, who was very uncharismatic. Utterly lacking in the political charisma that had propelled Clinton, Gore withered under the Bush's political attacks. And so here is a picture of Gore versus Bush. I remember this well, the election of 2000. It was a bizarre election. In my lifetime, it was the first time we had to wait weeks after the election. His election was on November 7th, I think, and it was well into the middle of December before we knew who won the election. And that was because the election was very close, and it came down to depending upon Florida. I remember Tim Russert on Meet the Press holding up a sign saying Florida, and he said, Florida, Florida, Florida. So now whenever you hear on the news somebody repeated something 3 times, that began with Tim Russert saying the election's going to come down to Florida, Florida, Florida. So the lawyers descended on Florida. The governor of Florida was Jeb Bush, George Bush, younger brother. The Gore campaign called for manual recounts in several counties. There were problems with the actual paper ballots where there were what they called hanging chads that left an ambiguity about how the person voted. The local election boards and the Florida Secretary of State, Kathleen Harris, and the Florida Supreme Court were all weighed in on this legality of this recount until it finally got to the U.S. Supreme Court, who stepped in and made a 5-4 decision in the Bush v. Gore, and ruled that the recount must come to an end, which then allowed Bush to win Florida by a margin of 537 votes, enough to win him the state and give him a majority in the Electoral College. He had won the presidency by 537 votes and a little help from the Supreme Court. And this was one of the first times, I don't know if it's the first, but it was one clear case where the loser of the popular vote won the Electoral College and thereby became president. So George W. Bush won a little over 50 million votes, 50,500,000 votes. And Gore had almost 60 million votes, popular votes. And Gore had 48.4% of the popular vote. Bush had 47.9%. However, because of the flipping Florida over to the red camp, George W. Bush got 271 electoral votes, which was only one more than he needed to win the Electoral College. And Al Gore only got 266. One of the closest elections in our history in terms of the Electoral College. And Bush's policies, his intent in terms of policies, was he wanted to push forward tax cuts to help the upper crust, the higher earners. This is a continuation of Reaganomics, or trickle-down economy, which believes that if you lower taxes on the wealthy, they will take that money and reinvest it in opening new businesses and new jobs, thereby creating more jobs, thereby creating more wealth, and as the tide rises, all boats will float. As we will see, there's some serious problems with that economic philosophy. In terms of looking back on how it's actually turned out, it hasn't performed as promised. There was also the burst of the dot-com bubble, which none of you would remember, but the dot-com bubble was in around 1999. It was when tech stocks such as Yahoo, Google, and others began to skyrocket and going up rapidly in the stock market, superinflating the stock market. Anytime you have a bubble, it will eventually burst in the economy, and the tech stocks were the bubble, and then it burst around 2000. Bush also, and this is one of my great regrets, he intended to make Latin America a primary focus of his administration. He had maintained a good relationship with Mexico when he was the governor of Texas. He became elected president. The governor of Sonora, Mexico, Vicente Fox, was elected in Mexico as president. He was the first Mexican elected president who was not from the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, which had been in power for over 70 years. And Bush and Vicente Fox intended to work together to find a peaceful, humane, amicable solution to the immigration problem and to improve the U.S. relationship with Mexico and also, by extension, the rest of Latin America. There was talk during this time of extending NAFTA to a free trade zone of the Americas, where the entire hemisphere of the Americas would be one open free trade zone without any tariffs. Old political cultural fights continued to be fought, and then the towers fell. And let me see if the towers fell, and just a few months into Bush's tenure in his first year as presidency, the Al-Qaeda attacked the Twin Towers and the Pentagon by hijacking airplanes. You've heard of it, I'm sure. We'll talk about that next time. But the war on terror erupted on September 11th or September 12th, 2001. I can tell you some memories I have of that time, but I won't go into my personal anecdotes. However, this completely cleared off the slate of Bush's intended policies and priorities, and he became caught up in events in the global war on terror, and this changed the direction of the United States. It also had a significant amount of influence in Latin America. And so we will continue our tour through American history, modern American history, in our next episode. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.